Hello everyone and welcome to episode 13 of Mr. Mackenzie's Distance Learning, World War II, Europe, 1939 to 41. Let's begin now. We're going to start today's discussion talking about World War I and really what kind of war World War I was. Now you're going to have to think back to the beginning of the semester when we did our in-depth look at World War I and try to remember what kind of war was World War I. And one of the big words and terms we learned in that unit was a war of attrition. Okay, a war of attrition. What does this mean? Okay, we really need to know what does attrition mean. And we have to know that it means that it's really going to just battle it out and grind the enemy out. That's what World War I really was, a battle of attrition. Who could last the longest? Who could outpace the enemy? Who could throw as many men and resources onto the battlefield to grind the enemy out? And it really caused the war to drag on. Okay, that's going to be quite a contrast to that of World War II. So how is this war of attrition in contrast to how World War II will be fought? And the key, the answer to this, is in the subtitle here, Blitzkrieg. And we need to know what the meaning of Blitzkrieg is. It's a German word that means lightning warfare. So World War II is going to have lightning warfare. It's going to be very quick by contrast to World War I, which really grinded things down, slowed the pace. And a lot of this really had to do with the technology at the time as well. In World War I, a lot of the weaponry and technology were for defensive measures. If we think of the machine gun in World War I, it was used for defensive purposes. It was big and heavy, and it needed 3 to 4 people to operate it. And it caused people to dig in, and we saw the birth of trench warfare in that. By World War II, technology has progressed quite a bit to the point where now soldiers can carry their machine guns into the battlefield. So it's going to allow things to be a lot more quick. Let's talk about France. For much of the 1920s and into the 30s, the French are preparing for a war of attrition. They know another war, another continental war, is on the horizon, but they're really preparing to fight the last war. They're preparing to fight a war of attrition. So they're getting prepared for a defensive war. And really, this is how they were successful in World War I. Even though France was destroyed, the countryside was destroyed in World War I, they were still on the winning side of it. So a defensive war, they had won in World War I. So they were preparing for another defensive war for the next war. And with that, they build a huge defensive line called the Maginot Line. And we can see it extending and really protecting the border of France and Germany. So the French are preparing to fight the last war, a war of attrition. But the Germans have been preparing to fight the next war. And they're going to get a trial run at Blitzkrieg. They're going to get a trial run with their new technology, with their new air force. And where do they get a trial run at Blitzkrieg? You should know this by now because we spent a good week of lectures on this, and that's the Spanish Civil War. So Germany gets a trial run at Blitzkrieg, but other kind of Western democracies, Great Britain and France in particular, are sitting this one out. They are preparing for a defensive war, and Germany is preparing for the offensive. And they are going to be using all new technology, all new weaponry, because they've been rebuilding through the 1930s with Hitler's rearmament program. So they They are using a brand new Air Force and a brand new tanks. And the French will be using the old ones from World War I. The scope of today's lecture is from 1939 to the end of 1941, and it's really a close-up look at the first half of World War II. And we're going to take note that the first half of World War II goes extremely well for Germany. Extremely well for Germany. From 1930 to 1940 and early 1941, things are going really well for Germany. But then we're going to see in the latter half of World War II, things will go quite poorly for Germany. So the main focus of today's lecture is really going to be seeing Germany's aggressive actions in Europe up to 1941. Let's start our talk with Poland. Okay, September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. We know in 1938, Germany had a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union that they would both kind of go in and take over parts of Poland. Now, when that happened, the policy of appeasement was dead. No longer could the British and French sit on the sidelines and appease these aggressive actions, and they declared war. Now, when they declared war, we're going to kind of talk about how it's a big kind of difference between how World War I started. When World War I started, Germany invaded into Belgium and then into France, and then the British had an expeditionary force there, and then pretty much from the get-go, there were battles on the Western Front, and it didn't stop until the armistice. Now, when Germany invades into Poland in September of 1939, yes, Britain and France declare war, but there's not going to be a whole lot going on. And we're going to even get what we refer to as the Phoney War, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But what will be a major difference between World War I and World War II? There are more soldiers that die in World War I than compared to World War II. But the total amount of loss of life is much greater in World War II because we see the civilians directly involved in World War II. Okay, so World War I, we see the loss of many soldiers. But in World War II, we see a loss of many civilians. Civilian city centers will be targeted. The people will be directly affected by this war. There will be bombings of major cities, and the civilians will be heavily impacted on this war. So speaking to how civilians will be directly affected by World War II, no other country other than Poland really is affected as much. Poland will suffer the most per capita, more than any other country. They lose about 20% of its population. But remember, World War II, this is a total war and nothing is off limits. Poland really can't put up much defense against Germany. Geographically speaking, Poland has a massive frontier to defend, and they are really ill-equipped militarily. We also have to remember that Germany has all new stuff. They had to demilitarize in the 1920s, and then much of kind of the 1930s, they built up new stuff to fight the next war. Now, Poland really gets no support from Britain and France. Why? Why don't they get any help from Britain and France? I mean, Britain and France declared war once Germany invaded, but why are they really getting no actual support from them? Well, we have to remember that they had to go through Germany. Geographically, if France or Britain wants to get to Poland, they'd have to go through Germany to get there. So they'd have to go through the country that they're at war with to go help Poland, their ally. So why doesn't France go and support Poland? I mean, if we think of Britain, Britain has the best navy in the world. They can't really sail their ships up into Poland. they have to kind of build up their army again and send them over to Europe. And that's going to be hard because you can't really march them through Germany to get to Poland. And why doesn't France go and support Poland? What has France been building throughout much of the 20s and 30s? A defensive measure of the Maginot Line. And if they cross that, and their soldiers are now in front of the Maginot Line, it becomes useless. It's just going to shoot their own soldiers in the back. So they can't really send their soldiers off because they are preparing to fight a defensive war. And sending their soldiers in front of the Maginot Line would render it useless. So this brings us to the Phoney War. The idea that war had been declared, but it doesn't seem like war is being fought. After Germany invades Poland, Britain and France declare war, but there's no real action on the ground. At this time, Britain and France are really building up their army and their military again. War is going on, but nothing much is going on in the West. So, war is going on. War is happening. Germany is invading into Poland and not meeting much defense there. But in the West, it doesn't really seem like they're at war. Now, how does this differ from the start of World War I? Okay, think back to those beginning days of World War I. Once Germany invaded Belgium and invaded into France, war had started, and it was a continual battle of attrition till November of 1918 with the armistice. From the get-go, war was on. So there's a big difference now in how World War II starts. World War II starts, Germany has invaded Poland. The Western allies of France and Britain have declared war, but there's no action. Hitler's next move is to go into Scandinavia. Hitler wants Denmark and Norway. Now, why does he want Norway? What's so important about that? If we think about what happened to Germany in World War I, okay, Germany remembers what happened to Germany in World War I. Hitler remembers their troubles. Troubles in their strategy to fight a war on two fronts and the struggles that they had on the home front with the British blockade. Now, controlling Norway is going to be important for Germany. So why does he want Norway? Well, you can get far more naval ports. You could be in striking distance of Britain. You could stage attacks on the British mainland. It's going to make it harder for Britain to invoke a blockade against German supplies. And they could also use the iron from Norway to make steel for their war machine. So having Norway is going to be very important strategically. It's going to make it really hard for Britain to invoke that blockade that kind of suffocated Germany in World War I and starved the people and made them demand for a peace. Hitler does not want to see that happen again. Now, once Norway falls, Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, will resign. Appeasement has been a total failure and has kind of blown up in his face. We are now at war. We need a wartime Prime Minister. So Neville Chamberlain is out, and this guy, Winston Churchill, is in. He will be elected in 1940 as Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Winston Churchill was one of the most vocal people about standing up to Hitler in the mid to late 30s. Britain is now at war and will need a wartime Prime Minister. And Winston Churchill will unite the country. He'll inspire the country with some just great speeches, and we'll kind of reference those throughout these lectures. Next, into France. Hitler remembers what Germany went through in World War I. They had to fight a war on two fronts. Hitler does not want to make that mistake again. So very strategically in 1938, he signs a pact of non-aggression the Nazi-Soviet Pact of Non-Aggression with the Soviet Union. So the East, he doesn't really have to worry about the Soviet Union. He's already invaded into Poland, and he has already gone into Norway in the north. Now he can focus on France. And the fall of France will actually come pretty swiftly. We do see the British Expeditionary Force is evacuated at the port city of Dunkirk. You can see it there on the map. And this is often referred to as a miracle, the miracle of Dunkirk. And it's basically a rescue mission that the British Navy saved 400,000 British soldiers from the beaches. And they were just kind of standing there stranded to be kind of taken prisoner by Germany. But so successful was this evacuation that they spun it in the news as a miracle. So we get this event that we call the miracle of Dunkirk, because they thought maybe we go in and we save 20,000 guys if we're lucky, and they end up saving 400,000 British soldiers who will eventually live to fight again. Winston Churchill has to get on the radio, though, and say, wars are not won by evacuations. Yes, we can kind of be proud and spin this as a success, but this is a retreat and nothing more. But now France is kind of left on its own, and France does put up a little bit of a fight, but eventually will surrender to Germany. Now, this is seen as one of Hitler's mistakes, that he didn't cut off the escape quick enough. Hitler was very focused on the city of Paris. He wanted to capture the city. He wanted to control the city of Paris, and he should have been focusing on this evacuation. So he didn't cut off the escape quick enough and was focused on taking Paris. Now, Paris and France remembers the toll of World War I. Other cities have kind of surrendered to Germany's Blitzkrieg. So France doesn't want the total destruction of her cities. Puts up a bit of a fight, but ultimately surrenders to Germany. Now, Germany doesn't take all of France. Germany invades France through Belgium, just like they did in World War I. And the Maginot Line now seems like the biggest waste of money ever. Those Maginot guns don't turn all the way around to fire upon German army once they are in France. So the Germans are now occupying northern France and the Atlantic coast. Why is this important? So it is important that Germany occupies northern France and the Atlantic coast. We'll eventually refer to it as Hitler's Atlantic Wall, because this is going to provide a staging point to launch into Britain. Also, Germany will call it the Atlantic Wall to stop an invasion of the Atlantic coast. So now you have a protection of Europe. The allies of the British, who are kind of left alone to fight, cannot get a foothold into Europe at this time. Southern France will still be under a French flag. It'll be known as Vichy France, named after the city of Vichy, you can see on the map there. But it will be a puppet regime of Nazi Germany. It will be a French government with a French president, Marshal Pétain. Marshal Pétain was a French general during World War I, was very big at the Battle of Verdun. He is the puppet leader to the Nazis. So why is the German armies doing so well versus the Allied armies at this time? So here we are in 1940. Poland has been invaded. Scandinavia has been invaded. France has surrendered. And it looks like Hitler has a good grip on Europe. The British Expeditionary Force has retreated back to Britain. Things are going very well for Germany at this time. More success at this point than the entirety of World War I. Why are they doing so much better than the Allies? Well, the tactic of Blitzkrieg is doing very well. Lightning warfare works really well. New and improved technology, offensive weaponry, not the defensive kind that we saw in World War I. We also see a lack of leadership, or at least a unified leadership, from the Allied leaders, which will eventually change when we get to the Grand Alliance between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. But Germany is united, well-led, with better technology and military than the Allies, and they are doing very well. They have a firm grip on Europe at this point. So, now England is all alone. Really, it's Britain and her Commonwealth that are left to fight Germany. The United States will eventually get involved. They're going to be slowly getting out of those neutrality acts. We're going to talk about the cash and carry and the Lend-Lease Act a little bit later. But at this point, it's just Great Britain and her Commonwealth left to stand up to Germany. And Germany wants to defeat Britain. They're the only major power left. And Germany knows to take England out of the war, they're going to have to invade. They already have France. They have their Atlantic Wall there to protect an Allied invasion. And it also works as a staging point to launch their attack against Great Britain. And they have Norway as well. But why is it going to be hard to invade Britain? Well, if we think about geography, we know Great Britain is an island, and it's going to be very hard to mount a sea-to-land amphibious assault. So, to invade an island, you need two things. First, you need air superiority. You need to have control of the skies, because that's going to act as protection for your amphibious assault. An assault that's going to happen from the sea to the land. And Germany will have to do this if they want to invade Britain. But first they're going to have to take control of the skies, and that's going to be very hard. So Germany mounts what's known as Operation Sea Lion. This is also known as the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain was the air battles that took place over southern England. And it was at this time that we also see an evacuation of the children of these cities off into the rural countryside. I remember stories of my grandfather, actually, who would later enlist in the British Merchant Marines when he was a young boy, being evacuated with his brother to the countryside, to an uncle's house, saying goodbye to his parents and getting on the train and leaving was a pretty crazy experience for these children at this time. So Germany is targeting the cities, in particularly the city of London, from September to November of 1940. This is going to be known as the London Blitz. And the Luftwaffe will bomb London. The Luftwaffe will face against the Royal Air Force. Now, this is often referred to as Hitler's second mistake. At this point in time, Hitler really should have listened to his advisors. They called for the attack of air bases and factories, but Hitler wanted to hit the heart of the people and bomb London, the city centers. He really thought that this was going to lead to a British surrender. The British Royal Air Force win the Battle of Britain, and really Germany never gets air superiority. It's at this point that Winston Churchill gets on the radio to celebrate the success of the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain. In one of his famous speeches, we get the famous quote, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Meaning so many, the people of London, the people of Western democracy really, owed their lives and their liberty to the so few, these heroic pilots of the Royal Air Force. Now, this is the first time we see a defeat for Germany in World War II. It's not really a defeat of Blitzkrieg. It's in terms of their lightning warfare military tactics, it's more of a defeat for their air force. Now, had Hitler ordered strikes on British airfields, it would have been harder for the British to win. But instead, he wanted to hit the cities and break the morale of the people. So, Hitler will kind of give up on this fight, and Operation Sea Lion will not be a success. And he will now look to the east with the Soviet Union. So Hitler now looks to the east with the Soviet Union. We had the Nazi-Soviet Pact signed back in 1939, but like all pacts that Hitler signs, it's really just temporary. Hitler wants to defeat the Soviet Union so Britain can't use them as an ally. And we have to remember also at this point, Germany is not fighting a war on two fronts. France is out. France has surrendered, so they don't have to worry about the Western Front. They can focus on the East and the Soviet Union. And Great Britain has been kind of kept at bay. Hitler has his Atlantic Wall, so an amphibious invasion of northern France seems unlikely. So now the full focus will go on the Soviet Union. Now Hitler thinks he can defeat the Soviet Union easily. At this time, the Soviet Union is fighting its own war with Finland. This is known as the Winter War. Now, this goes well for the Soviet Union. Well, it's a victory for the Soviet Union. I wouldn't say it goes well for the Soviet Union, but it is a victory for the Soviet Union. But it's a Pyrrhic victory. And this is a term that really goes back to ancient Greece. This is really when you win a battle, but the victory is so costly that it sets you up to lose in the future. So yes, it was a victory for the Soviet Union against Finland, but so costly was this victory that it really had set them up for future failure in the next war. So this is going to be, the Soviet Union find themselves in a tough spot when all of a sudden Germany looks to invade. Now the Finns put up a good defense. The Soviet troops were ill-equipped and poorly led, and this is mainly due to Joseph Stalin. Now, why? Why are they poorly led? This is the Soviet Union. Why are they poorly led? What happened in the 1930s that may have caused this? Well, if we think what was going on in Russia and the Soviet Union under the leadership of Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, we know Joseph Stalin was a very paranoid leader and had a lot of mistrust of his top officials, anyone that didn't fully give their loyalty to him. So there were many purges of high-ranking military officials in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. So we see a purge of the military generals, and once they're gone, you're left with no real good leaders, just a bunch of yes men to Joseph Stalin. So, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, begins. Hitler invades the Soviet Union, the biggest military invasion in human history. And this was a three-pronged attack. First, marched in the north to Leningrad. The second was to march to Moscow. And the third was to head south through Stalingrad, a very important city. It was the namesake of their leader, to the oil fields of the Caucasus. So the first months of the attack go very well for the Germans. Initially, Stalin is unprepared for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The German Luftwaffe enjoys air superiority. The Russian military is short on supplies as well. And even various Eastern ethnic groups that were within the Soviet Union will join up with the Nazis as they move to attack the Russians. Groups like the Ukrainians, Lithuanians, people who lived in Eastern Poland would join up with the German military as they advanced into the Soviet Union. So much did they dislike the Russians that they were willing to join up with the Nazis as they advanced into Russia. So Operation Barbarossa will ultimately be a failure for Hitler. Now why? What went wrong? It started off so well. Why does the German invasion of the Soviet Union go so unsuccessfully for Germany? Well, geography of the Soviet Union was so big. The geography of Russia. Russia is huge. The sheer size of it was going to be impossible for Blitzkrieg. The army was moving quickly ahead while supplies were very slow to catch up. Those rough Russian winters. Okay, Germany got caught in the winter and the engines froze and their troops were unprepared for the harsh, cold Russian winters. The Russians will also employ a scorched earth policy. And we should really know what this means. As the Russians were retreating back to their major cities, they were burning up and destroying the land and the crops and the fields, leaving nothing for the German military to live off of. Okay? This was right out of Russia's playbook. They did the same thing to Napoleon a good century and a half, if not two, earlier. Scorched earth policy. As they retreat to the major cities, they use up all the resources, they burn up everything, they destroy the land, leaving the military nothing to live off of. And the sheer size and geography of Russia meant that they eventually had to give up and go back to Germany. So let's talk about the outcomes of Operation Barbarossa. Well, now it looks like Britain has a new ally with the Soviet Union. So ultimately, Hitler fails at preventing a two-front war. Yes, France has surrendered and is out of the war, but now he has the Soviet Union in the east and Great Britain in the west. So it looks like he's kind of caught in a two-front war at this point. This is really the first failure of Blitzkrieg warfare. The Soviet armies don't surrender Stalingrad. It's pretty much destroyed, but they don't surrender it. The Battle of Stalingrad, we see 200,000 German soldiers dead. Another 91,000 are taken prisoner. So we see this is kind of the first time that the German Blitzkrieg has failed. We saw failure in the Battle of Britain, but that wasn't really land warfare tactics of Blitzkrieg. That was the German Luftwaffe failing against the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force. This is the first time their land tactics of Blitzkrieg had failed. So this is a major turning point in the war. By December 7th of 1941, this is a very important day that should be ringing bells in your brains right now. We see the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. The United States declares war on Japan. A few days later, Germany will declare war on the United States. So this is a major turning point in this war. In 1940, things were going extremely well for Germany. They had already invaded Poland. They had taken Scandinavia. France had surrendered, and the British had been driven out of the continent and kept at bay on their island nation. Things were going well for Germany. By the end of 1941, Germany found itself at war with Great Britain and its Commonwealth, the Soviet Union in the east, and now they had declared war on the United States. A big turning point in the war. And that's where we're going to stop our lecture today. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.